Welcome to ThinkCast. I'm Kasey Panetta. I'm joined today by Arun Chandrasekaran, VP Analyst, to talk about this year's top strategic technology trends. This is one of our most popular research pieces and symposium sessions, so I definitely recommend visiting Gartner.com or checking the show notes for a link to download the ebook. On today's episode, we're going to talk about 6 of the 12 trends, plus the big 3 themes, and how executives can use this research in their planning. Thanks so much for joining us, Arun.
Thanks for having me.
So this is one of my favorite pieces of research. I feel like I say that about a lot, but I really, truly mean it. This one is really interesting every year. This year, there's 12 trends. How do you select those 12 trends?
Well, there are several inputs we consider to arrive at these trends. There are more than 2,000 analysts at Gartner. They all have an opportunity to nominate these trends. We discuss them widely in our research communities and they vote on them. We also look at a lot of quantitative data. We look at inquiries. We look at survey data, particularly our CIO, CTO, and board of directors surveys. And we also look at published research, such as hype cycles and technology radars. We're also humble enough to admit that we don't know everything. We also talk to a lot of external ecosystem participants, for example, academic institutions, research labs and large vendors, venture capitalists, startups. So this effort is a cumulative effort that triangulates all of this. The one thing that I want to add here quickly is this year was truly unique in many ways. The past 18 months have triggered faster change than ever before, as you know. Hence, we had to do some tightrope walking, which is to ensure that the trends reflect the fast-changing priorities of CIOs. But at the same time, we're actually picking trends that are long-term technology bets that organizations need to make.
So the 12 trends actually fall under 3 bigger themes. Can you talk about those 3 themes and how they all work together?
Yeah, you're right. We've categorized the trends across 3 themes: engineering trust, sculpting change, and accelerating growth. The obvious question is, why these themes? We believe that these themes closely align with the CEO priorities, as outlined in the CEO survey that we do annually. And I'll talk about a little bit about those priorities now. CEOs want operational efficiency. So there are trends in this research that align with those goals of enabling a secure, scalable, and a very efficient digital foundation. CEOs are clearly interested in investing in digitalization. Hence, I believe that CIOs and CTOs need to invest in disruptive and emerging technologies to sculpt that change. Finally, CEOs want to accelerate growth. Maybe you can even argue that they want to recoup some of the lost growth over the last 18 months. Hence, Chief Information Officers and Technology Officers should be investing in trends outlined in this research that can accelerate top-line growth through product innovation and better customer experiences.
I know one question that we've gotten a few times when we talk about this research is that some of the trends on this year's are completely new to the list, and some of them have been featured maybe once or twice before. Why do some of them appear more than once, and why do some only kind of pop in and out for a year?
Yeah, that's a good question. These trends reflect long-term disruptive bets that we believe customers should be paying attention to. Hence, I believe this is about the future. It's not about trends that are mainstream today. We revisit these trends every year. Some mature and become mainstream, so we drop them, while there are some rare ones we drop since they may have failed to deliver on the promise. Hence, the trends appearing consecutively is by design. However, we do update our guidance to clients based on new use cases or new technologies or new ecosystem developments that we observe in the market.
I want to take a quick break to remind you that you can access all 12 trends, plus real-world examples and next steps for executives in our ebook. The link is available in the show notes or at Gartner.com. One of my favorite things about doing this podcast is I always get to ask the analyst questions that I have always been wondering. But do you have a trend on this year's out of the 12 that you think is particularly interesting or is your favorite?
Well, I believe all of them are interesting. But there are trends that are interesting to me as an analyst, and there are trends that I believe clients should be interested in due to the transformative potential that they have. Maybe there's also a bias inside me towards trends associated with cloud and AI, since I covered that as an analyst. But putting my bias aside, I think composable apps is an interesting trend because it closely aligns with the CIO priority of business composability. Business composability is this mindset, and you can even argue a set of operating capabilities that enable organizations to innovate and adapt rapidly changing business needs, which is something that we saw a lot in the last 18 months. So you could argue that business apps and business composability are an antidote for volatility. If you want to build long-term, strategic, successful companies, I think having business composability is very critical.
As you said, there's a lot of trends and they're all obviously very interesting. So I want to get into a few of them. Cloud is obviously a really big topic of conversation for everyone now. And one of the challenges there is that sort of lift and shift mentality. So I want to talk about cloud native platforms and how they help with that and what they are and what executives need to do with them.
Yeah, absolutely. I truly believe that software is eating the world, and cloud native platforms allow organizations to build and deliver software faster. Cloud native platforms sit at the intersection of cloud and DevOps, in my opinion, which is they enable organizations to build software faster, and hopefully, by the virtue of that, they can deliver better customer experiences. Cloud native platforms enhance developer productivity. And finally, they allow enterprises to build highly elastic and resilient applications, and they also enable customers to build services, digital services using newer application architectures, such as microservices. So cloud native platforms is fundamentally changing the way customers are building and delivering digital services, in our opinion.
The other topic that is sort of top of mind, and I think it's not hard to imagine this, that consumers are concerned about privacy. There's different legislation from a variety of governments. Organizations are trying to figure out how to both adhere to those new legislative pieces, but also still get the information they need to market. And one of our trends is privacy enhancing computation, which is a piece of this. Can you talk about why and what that is?
Yeah, enterprises today face two opposing goals. On one hand, they want to exchange more information, between teams or even with partners, for analytics. But on the other hand, they're facing increasing global and local compliance regulations. So the question is, how do you reconcile kind of these two opposing goals? And we believe the answer is through privacy enhancing computation because it allows you to securely share, pool, and analyze personal data without compromising privacy and confidentiality. Let me give you an example here. For example, there is Deliver Fund, which is a US based nonprofit organization with a mission to tackle human trafficking. So its platforms use homomorphic encryption, which is one of the privacy enhancing computation technique, so that its partners can conduct data searches against extremely sensitive data, such as human trafficking data, with search as well as the results being encrypted. There are other techniques here as well, such as differential privacy or even hardware level system protection that are part of this expansive trend. So we believe that privacy is going to be a very critical need in the enterprise in the future, and collaboration and analytics are going to be an equally important need. And privacy enhancing computation really allows organizations to reconcile both of those key imperatives together.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting and it's easy to see how that trend is going to change the world. As we mentioned, trends do appear on the list sometimes a couple years in a row. And one of those is hyperautomation. But why does it remain so important? And how has it evolved from maybe the first time it was on the list till now?
Yeah, sure. Let me first maybe define hyperautomation in a simple sentence. Hyperautomation is the automation of business and IT processes. We do believe that everything that can be automated will be automated in this decade and beyond. Hyperautomation has increased in importance, to answer your question, because of several reasons. I think the first and the foremost reason is the increasing business focus on growth, digitalization, and more importantly, operational efficiency and operational excellence. The second reason I would argue is the broader industrialization of IT that we are seeing, where the focus is on automating IT processes, particularly trying to automate IT processes that are viewed as undifferentiated heavy lifting within enterprises today. In terms of how hyperautomation has evolved, it's evolved in many ways. We are seeing increasing power and ubiquity of technology tools such as robotic process automation or RPA, low code, no code solutions. And we're also seeing increasing maturity in event driven architecture that really, really lend themselves very well to the automation initiatives within the enterprise.
I want to pause quickly to invite our listeners to learn how to create an action plan to master business composability. The 2022 CIO Agenda analyzes data from more than 2,300 CIOs and technology executives to figure out how organizations developed high business composability and pushed ahead of their peers while creating an organization designed to deal with today's volatility. Download the ebook in the show notes. So, can you give an example of sort of how that thinking on hyperautomation has evolved from maybe the first time we saw it on the list, like an example of what that would have meant a couple years ago versus what it means now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think on one hand, there is technology advancements that will allow you to analyze the processes, mine the processes, suggest improvements to the processes very well. So the technology itself has evolved to be a lot more intelligent than it was. But when I think about the use cases, I clearly see some patterns. The first pattern that I see is a lot of the focus on automation was much more back office oriented, right? It was not really, partner focused or customer focused. I think that's a change that we are starting to see now, where a lot of this is customer facing applications. A simple example of this could be things like conversational AI or chatbots, where you're actually putting a machine or a software in front of your customer, and it's a software and obviously the analytics that's underpinning it that's interacting directly with the customer. So one major shift I would argue essentially is the confidence that customers and organizations are having today to use automation more and more for customer facing initiatives as well, not just for back office use cases.
The next one I want to talk about is AI engineering, which I've spent a lot of times with these trends and I don't fully understand it yet. So if you could explain what AI engineering is, let's start there.
Yeah, let me start off by saying the obvious, which is AI is the most transformative opportunity in business and IT today, right? In this decade and beyond. However, the challenge for a lot of organizations today is the AI projects are also characterized by very high failure rates. So they're trying to kind of reconcile these realities, which is on one hand, they're super excited by the potential that AI has, but at the same time, they're also trying to mitigate some of the failures that they're experiencing in their environments. And we believe AI engineering is the answer to it in the sense that AI engineering is a discipline of operationalizing AI models using better integrated data pipelines, more automated model development with very strong governance built into it, and also automating the deployment of these models into production environments. I know that was a mouthful in terms of what I said. Let me try to make it a little real with an example, right? For example, let's take Georgia Pacific. It's a manufacturer of pulp and paper products, and they monitor models for drift that can erode business value. So the model drift can happen because the production data often is not exactly the same as your training data. So what they essentially do is they have monitoring systems in place that quantify these drifts, and they apply rapid changes to the production model using automated processes, often in real time or close to real time, to maintain high degree of model accuracy. So AI engineering is the discipline of automating this process so that your models are functioning with high degree of accuracy, which means that you're really reaping the business value of what you set out to in the first place.
And are we seeing that this is making a real impact? Because it seems like this is making AI engineering a very scalable and approachable project for organizations who might have been intimidated by, what can be fairly high failure rates. So are they really open to trying this kind of trend?
I would definitely say so. I think you're also hitting on another important point here, which is AI engineering is, of course, about reducing model failures and AI project failures within the environment. But it's also about accelerating how soon you can get models into production. Another data point here essentially is we think for most enterprises, it takes anywhere from 9 to 12 months to get their models into production. By using AI engineering best practices, again, to your point, they can scale these processes so much more effectively that they can get these models into production in a relatively shorter span of time. So it's not just about accuracy and reducing failure rates, it's also about accelerating time to market, which I believe is very, very important for enterprises today.
You just brought up an interesting point that we probably should address before we talk about our remaining two trends that we're going to talk about, which is what is the time frame for most of these technologies to be enacted by organizations? Because I know AI engineering, you just gave us kind of a shortish time frame. What are we looking for when we're talking to organizations about how they should be thinking about timelines?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm glad that you asked that question. When we look at the strategic technology trends, and I've been part of this research for 4 years now, we are not looking for trends that are mainstream today, nor are we looking for trends that are going to be mainstream 10 years from now. So the sweet spot of trends that we are looking at is typically a 2 to 5 year time frame, a 2 to 5 year time frame by which these technologies will be mainstream or early mainstream for enterprises to consume. And trends where we also believe that there is a commercial ecosystem that'll build around it, that'll make it viable for enterprises to go ahead and deploy the underpinning technologies that are supporting these trends. So to answer your question, typically the time frame we are looking at is a 2 to 5 year period.
Okay, great. I just wanted to set the baseline because I think with some of these, depending on the maturity of your organization, it might be you're taking a first step. So I think setting the time frame expectation is super important.
You bet.
Getting to our remaining two technologies trends that we're going to talk about, one sort of, I'll call it a very of the moment theme, is distributed enterprise. So can you talk about what that is and kind of what I'm referring to as far as why it's super applicable to the moment we're all experiencing?
Well, if there is a trend of the year award, it'll certainly go to distributed enterprise, right? With the rise in remote and hybrid working patterns, and kind of the traditional office centric environment getting completely disrupted, distributed enterprise is a reality that a lot of organizations are waking up to, with staff and customers and partners spread all across the globe, working in kind of these virtual and remote environments. However, these new hybrid work realities mean that partners and consumers are also now remote. So organization must plan for how this is going to impact their workers, their partners, and customers everywhere. The less obvious aspect of this is many enterprises also have to adapt their business models to these remote first culture or a virtual first culture, which we're going to see for a long period of time. So the question then is, what should they be doing? I think the first thing they have to do is to make sure that they have tools and processes and techniques to reduce employee fatigue and burnout. And they have to fundamentally re architect their collaboration tools, their security tools, their workspaces and processes to really match this new hybrid work environment. Secondly, they need to make sure that they plan to pivot their business models to capture market share from customers and consumer changes that are going to happen because the world is going to move to this virtual first environment in the future.
So I try not to pick favorites, but clearly I have favorites. And this next one is actually, I think, one of the coolest trends, which is generative AI. Can you explain a little bit about what it is, but also more what the future implications of it are?
Yeah, you're not alone, by the way, in saying that this is my favorite trend. You could add me to that list, and I'm sure there are many listeners that would, agree with us. Because generative AI is perhaps the most transformative of all trends in this research, arguably. Let me explain what generative AI is, and I'll give you some examples, both in our consumer lives as well as in kind of enterprise setting, in terms of how this is going to play out. Generative AI is a form of artificial intelligence that learns digital representation of artifacts from sample data and uses it to generate its own new and realistic artifacts that kind of retain a likeness to the original data that it was exposed to. Let me try to make it a little real in our consumer lives, right? We've all experienced generative AI in some shape or form in our lives every day. For example, this could be artificial intelligence completing our sentences as we type, or AI generating paintings. For example, there was a AI generated painting that was sold for $500,000 by Christie's a couple of years ago, or even more recently, in fact, this month, where Beethoven's 10th symphony, which was unfinished because he died as he was composing it, was actually completed by an AI model. So this is kind of broadly what we mean by generative AI, which is the ability of AI to create things that kind of resemble real life artifacts. But the broader question here is, what does this mean from an enterprise perspective or from a CIO perspective? I'm going to give you some use cases or even case studies to illustrate it. For example, the UK Financial Authority, Conduct Authority, they're using generative AI to create synthetic payment data from 5 million records of real payment data. The reason for using the synthetic data set here is to create new fraud model without actually revealing individual data, because the synthetic data sets, while they resemble original data, but they don't have personally identifiable information in them. So the customer privacy is a very important driver here. We've also seen research, a lot of research coming out of it. For example, researchers have demonstrated the potential for generative AI to speed up identification of new organic materials, things like, for example, protein, or even like dyes, for example, like synthetic dyes as an example. Finally, much more closer to home for IT professionals, GitHub, Microsoft, and OpenAI, they've collaborated to create GitHub Copilot, which is a tool that can generate and recommend code to developers as they write software, which in the long run can have a significant impact in terms of how we do software testing and potentially software development. It's a little immature today, but the potential for that in the future is really transformative.
I love talking about the examples for that one. I just think that's so fascinating. Like you can imagine the potential for it. It's really cool. One thing we always try and do, obviously, here at Gartner is give our listeners actionable insights. So, how should executives go about using this research? How should they think about it? Should it be part of their strategic planning? Like, what are we advising?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would argue that they should really start off by looking at these trends and evaluating which of these trends are relevant to their organization. And more importantly, to create an action plan around it, right? For example, what's the business value of these trends? Maybe they can create a use case in a matrix in terms of identifying use cases that they want to prioritize and focus on, or maybe agree on timelines if they want to go ahead and pilot or implement any of these trends. Obviously, augmenting and enhancing skills around these are going to be vital to make sure that they're successful, or perhaps planning for budget allocation. So the first and the foremost step, in my opinion, is to create an action plan that includes everything from business value identification, use case matrix, agreeing on timelines, enhancing teams and skills, and more importantly, allocating a budget around it. Gartner is committing to publishing a lot of research around use cases and best practices and emerging vendors in this area. So you should also keep track of some of the upcoming research from Gartner in 2022 around each of these trends.
Thanks so much for joining us. Always a pleasure to have you and to talk about this research. Do you have any final thoughts?
I think I'll go back to where we started, which is the past 18 months have seen faster change than ever before. So I believe business and technology leaders today have a choice. They can either continue their digital innovation at the same pace, or they can go back to the status quo before the pandemic happened. I think the choice is obvious, in my opinion. We believe that these trends should certainly be on the radar of every leader to help them accelerate their digital business. And I wish them well in this journey.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Gartner ThinkCast is a production of Gartner. This podcast may not be reproduced or distributed in any form without Gartner's permission. It consists of the opinions of Gartner's research organization, which should not be construed as statements of fact. Content provided by other speakers is expressly the views of the speaker and or their organization. While the information contained in this podcast has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, Gartner disclaims all warranties as to the accuracy, completeness, or adequacy of such information. Although Gartner research may address legal and financial issues, Gartner does not provide legal or investment advice, and its research should not be construed or used as such. You can learn more at www.gartner.com.